Hello there, and welcome to episode number 33 of your Bamboo Chalupa Digital Marketing Podcast. My name is Brett Snyder. I am the president of Knucklepuck, and I'm joined by my co-host, Nate Shiver, the author of shiverweb.com.
Hello, hello.
So today we're going to talk about a tool that is publicly available, that is free, and that is something that most people, especially people who've been around digital marketing for a while, obviously know about, but really don't use into the full extent possible. And we're talking about what was formerly Google Webmaster Tools, but has recently been rebranded to the Google Search Console. Give a little bit of background on kind of Google Search Console, and I'll apologize in advance if we call it Webmaster Tools at any point throughout the episode. But Google Search Console kind of created a mutually beneficial arrangement between Google and between webmasters. It's why they called it Webmaster Tools to begin with, because they wanted to encourage people to install this snippet of code on their website under the guise that Google will provide you with information about how that website is performing. Now, to provide the information about how that website is performing, Google obviously needs access to that information. And so this idea of Webmaster Tools really gave Google an opportunity to get people to install additional tracking codes about site performance on their own individual websites. And Google gets more information about how people are interacting with and engaging on the website. And the webmaster gets info about how those interactions and engagements actually influence the search performance in the search engine.
That's a good reminder about the SEO industry in general. I think a lot of people who don't know about it think of it as, people who are trying to trick Google into getting better rankings. But it's important to understand that Google wants to have well-run, well-written, well-maintained websites because, like you said, it's a mutually beneficial relationship. And to do that, they also make Google Webmaster Tools Search Console fairly easy to install. To get it installed, not to get too basic, but there's several options nowadays. You can install it actually through your analytics code snippet, so you don't even have to add anything additional to your website code. You can.
That's honestly it's my favorite way to do it. It's the easiest way. It's one where we've told people from episode 1 that you have to have Google Analytics installed, that it's pretty straightforward. If you have the same login, really all you have to do is say verify through Google Analytics. If you're logged into the same Google account as your Google Analytics code is verified, it will automatically, once you hit verify, it'll automatically verify the access to Google Search Console.
Yeah, and even if you don't want to go that route, if you're having trouble, if you're doing a third party and you don't have the same Google account for whatever reason, you can always add a little snippet of code to the head section. You can even verify it through DNS if that's what you want to work through.
I have never, in all my years doing SEO, I have never even heard somebody say that they've done the DNS option, let alone done it myself. So I would say that the Google Analytics shared login would be that first option. Yeah. Then go to the HTML tag. Again, there are plugins. I know the Yoast plugin just lets you say what is the kind of the access code for your Webmaster Tools or your Search Console, and you drop it right in there. The DNS, and there's also an HTML file upload. I think there used to be an XML file upload, but they realized that was too complicated, so they got marginally less complicated with an HTML file upload. But the DNS and the HTML file are two options, but I have never, Nate, I don't know about you, but I've never seen or heard anybody use those options.
No, I think the DNS would just be in a very, very specific circumstance. But either way, DNS, even if you need that method, it is there. And so either way, Google wants you to have Google Webmaster Tools. But before we get into how do we actually use it for technical SEO, there's a few other things I want to mention about setting it up. First off, Google looks at protocols and subdomains as different properties. So you need to have your www version and your non-www version and any other subdomains all verified separately. And then if you're running your site on a secure protocol, HTTPS, that needs to be verified separately, and your unsecure, your HTTP, needs to be verified, even if you are site-wide HTTPS, just because it's going to be able to give you any issues that do come through. You need to be able to have access to those.
And there are ways to set your preferred version in there. So if you're redirecting non-www to www, you can identify it to Google, and it's actually a recommended best practice that you do so because it allows them to understand, again, you go straight to the source here. This is a direct line to the way Google is getting information about your site performance. So you can actually set what your preferred, version of the site is, but you have to verify these accounts individually in order to do that.
Exactly. And also when you're setting it up, especially if you're an agency or in a company context and you use say a group login, a group Google account, make sure that you set up email forwarding so that the right people are getting the right alerts because, Brett, like you said, this is your direct line to Google. So if there are any crawl issues, or any hacking issues, if your site gets hacked and Google finds evidence of that, if there are new owners assigned, or if for whatever reason your site gets a manual penalty, this is how Google is going to communicate those issues to you. So, if you're setting up under a group login, make sure you have those fine details sorted out so that the right people are getting these messages.
Right. And I know it's something where that was much more the manual penalty alert. That was much more prominent and prevalent with Penguin when that came out. I don't know that there's been many that have come out recently, but that is, again, if they want to give you if something algorithmically has taken place on your site, Webmaster Tools, they basically dump those messages into an inbox. For us, what we do, we have one login, and then from that login, we go in and we do email forwarding for, the particular project managers on each individual account. And so that way we're able to have one where anybody can go in there if they need to go and dive into a particular client that we have. We've got everything consolidated in one place. It's not something where if there's turnover or if you have different people who are shifting priorities, then you're not saying, oh, well, so-and-so actually verified Webmaster Tools, but now whose login was tied to that? It's nice to be able to keep things consistently and then just set up email forwarding in that account. That way, if you have any change in your team or any turnover, you don't have to re-verify Search Console, but it also keeps basically a copy of all these messages in the, whatever that group login is, but it's also available in the Webmaster Tool. Excuse me, I'm glad to preemptively apologize for that. I still haven't gotten that out of my vernacular, but you still have it in the Search Console platform as well.
Yeah, you don't want the keys to your website data resting with one employee. Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, I know the biggest thing that we use Search Console for, and Nate, I know you do as well, is looking at the technical side of SEO. We'll touch on some of the on-page and the off-page a little later, but the real majority of what we want to talk about today is how we're going to use the technical data that comes straight from the horse's mouth to be able to influence the strategies that we want to implement so that Google can more efficiently crawl our website. That's if there's one thing that you get out of this and there's one thing that you look to Google Search Console and say, how can this help me? It gives you information on, optimizing the crawl rates and the crawl efficiency of your website.
Yeah, and crawl rates, I think we'll start there, is one of the more misunderstood pieces of data that you get, just because it's hard to know what the standard is or when you should be concerned. And the crawl rate report, when I look at it, I really look at any variances. And this is especially important if you're working with a large site, but even if you have a small site where Google is crawling your whole site every few weeks, every few days, you should still look for a few things. First off, you should keep a running benchmark of what is typical for your website. What's the typical crawl rate? So that if you see any anomalies, if the crawl rate spikes way up, if it spikes way down, you should be able to know that aligns with a site update. So, if you add a big section to your website, if you do a website relaunch, you should see Googlebot spike up in the crawl rate, or, if your site goes down, your crawl rate should go down. If you see an anomaly that should not be there, that's where you can start your investigative work.
And I think it's important to kind of talk about the relativeness of these, because there isn't really a standard for the number of, kilobytes downloaded per day. We've gotten questions about that as well. We're like, what should I be aiming for? And it's almost like, what kind of domain authority should I aim for? Well, you should aim to have one that's better than the competitors in your space. And being able to look at these crawl rates is something, as Nate said, looking at them as a trend, looking for spikes and peaks and valleys for what your standard crawl rate is. That's going to give you the information that something might be wrong. Now, it doesn't necessarily tell you exactly what is wrong, but it gives you an understanding that we need to be able to look into something, because as we said before, if Google has issues crawling your website, it doesn't matter how many links you've built. It doesn't matter how strong your content is. If they cannot crawl your website, you are not going to get in the top ranking positions, because that is just a major issue in how they process your information.
Oh, yeah. And there's just so many variables. And it also depends on your type of industry and your type of website. I mean, if you're a publisher and you're putting up multiple posts per day, I mean, Googlebot's going to be trained to want to come back and crawl that fresh content. Whereas if you're a large site with mostly static content that never changes, your crawl rate might look different. The important thing again is to look at variances. Do the download times look reasonable? If you're having troubles with your user speed and Googlebot is also taking a lot of time to download pages, that might be an issue. If you see Googlebot crawling a large number of pages, but they're not downloading many kilobytes of data, that might mean that Google is stuck on a crawl loop, where they're just crawling lots of parameter pages. You'll see this in e-commerce sites where Googlebot kind of gets stuck down a rabbit hole where it's just crawling the same thing over and over and over. And that might be a sign that you should investigate, what is Googlebot looking at, and how can you coach Googlebot throughout to download larger portions of your site and not get stuck like that.
And this ties back to, remember, page speed is still a small but growing aspect of the ranking algorithm. Page speed is, from a conversion rate perspective, Nate, we can try to find for the show notes the specific statistics here, but it's something like a 1% or 1 second increase in page speed time actually has, 20-30% increase on conversion rate. It's a very substantial impact here. And so being able to understand how Google is crawling and downloading at least gives you some insights into the page speed, because page speed is defined in terms of how Google defines it. And looking at these crawl rates really gives you an understanding of whether or not you need to devote some resources towards addressing those key issues.
Yeah, and just to segue into the next report, crawl errors, a lot of times Google will not even find URLs, and you'll get those reported in Search Console in the crawl errors report. And a lot of times this report is, I've heard it called the Go Home Google You're Drunk report, because you'll see pages and URLs listed in this report that do not exist anywhere on the web. You've never put them up. You've never published them. You don't know where they came from.
And there's a number of different crawl errors here.
Right.
Where you talk about these crawl errors, it'll give you server errors. Where are you having issues with your server? That actually is something that we did recently at KnucklePug. We found that there were a number of server errors being generated for a client of ours. And as we would go in there, we didn't see any issues because we can go through the site and the page would load. But because they were driving so much traffic, the server was starting to get overloaded and creating errors. That resulted in a decrease in traffic. It resulted in a decrease of conversions. And so being able to go into Search Console and say, hey, look, there's actually something having to do with how your server is, with load balancing on your server or anything else in terms of the amount of information this server is being asked to process, it is starting to throttle. These server errors are extremely valuable. I'm talking about your 503 errors, where there are 500 errors. These are the ones that will really let you know, is there something that needs to be done from an infrastructure standpoint to make sure that my site can continue to provide the information to users at the scale that they're asking for it.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the theme that we've touched on already of digging. Like, Google is giving you this data. It's up to you to dig and kind of put on a detective hat and investigate, why are these showing up? In the crawl errors report, like you said, it lists it by errors. It also lists them by priority. Google is going to say, hey, this looks like it's a priority to us, based on the URL, based on the links coming into it. You should address these basically from one moving downwards.
They'll also tell you when the error was identified.
Exactly.
It gives the date. So if you can see, this is an error, there is an option to mark as fixed. If you fix these things, you can actually go in there and say, hey, Google, this has been fixed. And again, remember, this information comes from when Google crawls the site. So if they haven't recrawled the page and you have addressed the issues, maybe they wouldn't notice it. Even if it was a page that was, hey, it was linked to from one page and you removed that, how is Google going to crawl that again? Probably not. And so you can actually go and mark these things as fixed, and looking at the date that it was identified is actually extremely valuable to understand whether or not you've implemented a solution since the time that it's been picked up.
Oh yeah, and the last thing I'll touch on with crawl errors is that this is a report where you can always dig deeper. I used Webmaster Tools Search Console for a embarrassingly long time before I figured out that you can click on the link. And I know this sounds like a newbie mistake, but I've seen new SEOs that they don't know that you can click on the link and Google will tell you where it found that link from and where that URL is linking out to. And so you can click and use it to quickly diagnose where these issues are.
And to give kind of an example for that, if you go in there and you say, hey, this page doesn't exist, I don't know where this is, and you say, oh, it's being linked to from an old deprecated link structure. Okay, obviously Google hasn't recrawled the original link because it doesn't exist anymore. And there were no external links to it. There's no internal links because the site structure's been updated. But now it gives you a sense to kind of qualify these errors in a way that makes sense to your particular circumstances.
Like that. Well, let's talk about the Fetch as Google tool. And this is basically your shortcut to diagnosing on-page script, and it's your shortcut to getting in the Google index. So this is a way where you can get your page directly into Google's index without having to wait for the Googlebot to come back and crawl.
For people who are kind of newer to SEO, back 10, 15 years ago, or maybe 15 years ago, wow. But back even 10 years ago, SEO companies would sell services that they will submit your site to the index. That was one of the core services that they'd offer. And that was basically the precursor to this Fetch as Google tool. Because if Google hasn't found your website, if there are no links to it, these agencies would actually say, we have to submit your site to Google's index before they'll kind of use this Fetch as Google tool to be able to say, I want to see how Google's crawling it. There is still the option to submit to index. One of my favorite things to do. And I'm very upfront with our clients about this. Like, listen, if we've made changes to the site, Google's going to find it in a couple of days. They're going to naturally crawl the site. This is not something where you have to submit to Google for them to recognize the changes. But if you've made changes to a website, you've updated internal link structures, you've updated content, you can submit as Google and they come back and they update the cached version of your site very, very quickly. I've seen it happen in as little as an hour where you get the new cached version into the index. So that way you're not having to wait 3 or 4 days for them to recrawl and be able to pick up your changes. You get to basically go right to the front of the line and say, I need you to crawl and resubmit this page because there are changes to it. I want you to pick up the changes to this site and I want you to pick them up immediately.
Yeah, and the other thing that Fetch as Google can do, especially now, I guess it was 2 years ago in May of 2013, where Googlebot was made to where it could process JavaScript and CSS. So it can render your page as a user would see it. Well, this is the Fetch as Google tool is where you can see if Googlebot is loading the page as it exists. So, if you're blocking any JavaScript or you're blocking any CSS to where Googlebot doesn't see the page as a user sees it, this is where you will find out those issues and where you can fix it, because it'll give you a list of scripts and CSS files that it was able to find, but was not able to access and use to render the page. And it will give you a priority, whether or not Googlebot really needs this or whether or not this is something where you should go and fix now. A lot of times I know on older WordPress installs, this is a big issue where the robots.txt will be blocking the folder that holds JavaScript. And so, if you have a slider or you have any text behind JavaScript, Googlebot won't be able to access it. Not because Googlebot can't process JavaScript, but because it's blocked by your robots file. This is where you're going to find those kind of errors.
And I've had issues with that. We've had clients, we've had significant problems, and we finally diagnosed the error because we realized that we had implemented a navigation menu that incorporated at least some degree of JavaScript, but we were blocking all of that. So essentially we said, hey, we're going to implement this much more robust navigation menu. We flipped the switch and traffic went down because even though we're seeing the navigation menu on, we completely stripped it away because we were blocking their access to these elements. And that was something where we had a significant impact on the traffic. And the last thing, and this is something that is, the default setting for Fetch as Google is going to fetch the desktop version. Something that I absolutely recommend that every single person do, whether you have 5% mobile traffic or whether you're looking at 50, 60% of your traffic coming in as mobile. You can fetch as Google. You can do the same rendering tools that Nate was just talking about, but you can do it from Google's mobile crawler. And this gives you an understanding where if you see, I think our site is responsive, or anybody last April who saw that Google is going to start incorporating or had a big change to the way they process mobile, the Fetch as Google tool does allow you to crawl it through Google's mobile crawler. The default is desktop, but there's a drop down to select the crawler that you want to fetch as, and you absolutely 100%, you hit pause right now and go check this out. But you want to go in there and see how your mobile site is being crawled as well, because as most people understand at this point, mobile traffic and mobile kind of engagement is skyrocketing. You're talking about, like I said, we've got clients that are driving 100,000 visits a month with more than 50% of the traffic coming in on a mobile device. It is essential that you confirm that Google is crawling your mobile site effectively. If you're kind of moving into that section, you've just done a rebrand, it lets you understand how things are being rendered. But please, please, please look at not just the default desktop fetches Google, but definitely the mobile smartphone crawler as well.
The next tool that's kind of in this technical SEO section is the robots.txt tester tool. And this tool, it does exactly what it says. It looks at your robots file, which again is the file that all good bots go and check to see what parts of the site they can and can't crawl. And and this is where you're going to find out if you're blocking pages or directories or resources that you might not want to block, or might be having additional consequences that you might not realize. This is where you go in and check to see if your implementation is correct. This is also where you can go and troubleshoot, before you put up a new implementation. Say if you're running a large e-commerce site and you want to block, certain account pages or, sale pages, whatever you want to block bots from, you can go and test that out to make sure that you're not going to accidentally block another whole section of the site that you do want Googlebot to be able to access.
And when we say you can test this, if you actually go into the dashboard itself for the robots.txt tester, you can go in there and change the robots.txt. It won't change the actual file, but you can physically edit what Google is using as the robots.txt file, and then drop in sections of your site to see if they are accessible. And when you do that, Google will actually highlight if it's restricted, Google will actually highlight the line in your robots.txt file that is causing that page or that resource to be excluded. When you go in there and basically use your robots.txt as a draft, it's kind of, you can update that. It never pushes to your live site. It doesn't actually affect how Google crawls it unless you update the file itself. But you can basically, it's like a staging server almost for being able to manipulate that robots.txt file and confirm that you, as Nate talked about, the consequences of that change. You can confirm what type of consequences are going to result from making certain changes to the robots.txt.
All right, and the next tool is the URL parameters tool. And outside of professional SEOs and webmasters of large sites, not many people use this tool, mainly because it comes with a warning. So if you actually click over to the tool, you'll see a warning that says, use this feature only if you're sure how parameters work. Incorrectly excluding URLs could result in many pages disappearing from search. The reason that shows up is because this is really only useful for certain types of sites. Usually e-commerce sites, but really any large site where you're having to, deal with a crawl budget, crawl rate, and you want to be able to help Google understand what parameters are doing what, if they're sorting, filtering, etc., to help address duplicate content.
Sure, and to kind of give more of an example there, let's go through the actual specifics there. So if you have page content, the first thing Google asks you is, does it, no, it does not affect page content, so it just tracks usage, or yes, it changes, reorders, or narrows page content. Those are the two options that are available for you as the first step. Now, if you say it doesn't affect page content, it only tracks usage, what Google's going to do is they are going to crawl one representative URL. They're basically going to ignore that parameter and say, this is just to track usage. It's exactly the same page. They're just basically a parameter way of cookieing the user. In that sense, they're only going to do one representative URL. Now, what Nate's talking about here, if you select changes, reorders, or narrows page content, then it gives you an additional drop-down that provides some other options, some other ways to annotate these parameters, and then you can give Google direction as to what they should do with those parameters. So you can go in there and say, yes, this sorts or narrows, specifies, translates, or paginates. Or there is even the option to say other, one that doesn't fit all of that. But then once you select that, then you're able to tell Google if you want them to decide, which is the default setting. You want them to crawl every URL. They want you to only crawl URLs with certain criteria that you can establish, or to crawl none of those. And so we just wanted to make sure that that's really clear here, because again, it is an intimidating aspect of Google Search Console, because it comes with that warning, and it's something where they say, hey, pages are going to disappear from search. But if you are really kind of conscious of the way that you approach this, and you know exactly what your parameters do, if it's a filtering or a sorting parameter, and you can annotate it as such, it allows Google to prioritize the way that they crawl these parameters and understand the impact that these parameters have on how your page content is presented.
Yeah, and just to bring it full loop, this is the tool that you would go to use if, say, you're looking at the crawl rate report and you're seeing a lot of pages being crawled without many kilobytes being downloaded. If you go and you do some searches for your site in Google Search, and you're seeing a lot of the same pages being repeated with the same parameters, that will be a duplicate content issue. And this is the type of tool that you'll go to help solve that issue.
So one last, talking through kind of some of the technical things here, the last thing that we want to touch on are the XML sitemaps. You've heard us talk about XML sitemaps all the time. Really, this is just a file where you're able to prioritize how Google crawls through your site. General recommendation, unless your site is 500,000 pages, your XML sitemap for your average site, and looking at the 100 to 5,000 pages, put the pages that are going to be most important, the ones that you expect to rank. You don't have to put your privacy policy or any of kind of these superfluous pages in there. But the XML sitemap allows you to tell Google which pages they should crawl, and you can set priorities. So for example, your home page would be priority 1. Your top navigation pages may be priority 0.9. Now your old legacy archive news pages, maybe those are lower priorities. And what this allows us to do, and here's, Nate, I'm sure that you can kind of speak to this as well, where the way people use these XML sitemaps incorrectly is that they put everything at the same priority. To quote one of my favorite movies, when everyone's incredible, nobody is. And so using the XML sitemap to be able to establish legitimate priorities for Google lets them recognize which pages you feel are going to be most important to your users, the ones that you want to be front and center. And you can submit this XML sitemap directly to Google Search Console, and it will tell you if there are errors in the sitemap. It will tell you if things are being picked up inappropriately.
Yeah, I've always thought of XML sitemaps sort of as the roadmap that you give Google when they show up at your site. So Google isn't going to exclusively use the XML sitemap to crawl and index your pages. It's still going to have to drive the roads, so to speak, or click through the links. But the XML sitemap is sort of your guide. These are the pages I really want you to look at. This is how often I want you to look at them. Take this into consideration in your crawl. And that's kind of what Google's going to use it. I wouldn't solely, I've seen a lot of people who they'll bury some orphan pages way down on their site and never link to them internally, and then just solely rely on the XML sitemap to get those pages crawled frequently. That's not an ideal solution. The ideal solution is to still integrate those pages into your site, if they are that important, and then use the XML sitemap to, like Brett says.
Right. It's to support your existing site structure. It's not to replace it. The reason that we focus so heavily on these technical items is that the foundation of your website is really integral to how Google and other search engines as well are going to be able to process the information you put on your site. Think about it like the foundation of your house. If you're going to invest in this beautiful home, master bathroom with all the fixtures in there, you're going to have a man cave that has the big, flat screen TV that covers the entire wall. You're going to create this beautiful, magnificent home, but if it's on a shoddy foundation, then the home is really, you're kind of building a house of cards. And we talk about the technical infrastructure. It's something that I know is near and dear to Nate and myself. It's something that we've really kind of focused in on in terms of our approach to SEO. But Google Search Console provides you an extraordinary amount of information. And then from there, it really enhances how your on-page factors are going to be evaluated. It ensures that when you have links that are going over to your site, that they're really going to provide a value add to that domain authority and increase the likelihood that you're going to rank for your targeted phrases. But it all starts with that strong technical foundation, and Google Search Console provides you with an immense amount of information to be able to do that effectively. And so that said, we are actually going to break this episode up into two separate sections. On next episode, we're going to talk a little bit more about the on-page factors, how to use the HTML improvements of the search analytics functions. We're going to talk about how to look at links to your site to be able to recognize potential penalties or potential negative SEO associated with your domain. Now that we're going to give you a chance to go back and really dig into kind of some of the technical elements of Search Console. And in our next episode, once we have that technical foundation in place, we're going to walk you through how to leverage the tools from an on-page and an off-page perspective to make sure that you are putting yourself in the best possible position to capture those top rankings for your marquee keyword phrases.
All right. Well, you can find previous episodes, links to everything we mentioned, and our contact information at bamboochalupa.com. If you don't want to miss another episode, including the upcoming part 2 of this series, go subscribe to the podcast in iTunes or your favorite podcast app. And while you're there, please do leave a comment or rating. We learn a lot from your feedback, and your ratings helps others to discover the show. So for Brett Snyder, I'm Nate Shiver. Thank you for listening.